Some family stories are meant to stay buried, but death has a way of digging up the truth. When I found the letters hidden in my great-grandmother's jewelry box, I realized that everything I thought I knew about my family was a carefully constructed lie. The woman I'd admired my entire life had been someone else entirely, and the man who destroyed her was still alive, still breathing, still collecting accolades for a life built on stolen dreams. My name is Amelia Cross, and I'm 28 years old. 3 months ago, I was just another financial analyst at Morrison & Associates, living a quiet life in Boston, visiting my elderly great-grandmother Rosalind every Sunday with flowers and stories about my week. She'd always seemed like the perfect matriarch, graceful, kind, with eyes that held secrets she claimed were just the wisdom of age. When she passed peacefully in her sleep last December, I thought I was prepared for the grief. I wasn't prepared for the rage. The letters were tied with a faded blue ribbon, tucked beneath the velvet lining of her jewelry box. My mother had asked me to sort through Rosalind's personal effects, a task I'd approached with the reverence you'd show a saint's relics. The first letter was dated 1954, written in my great-grandmother's careful script, addressed to someone named Theodore Blackwood. The words made my blood run cold. "My dearest Theodore," it began. "I've completed the designs for the Meridian project as promised. The architectural plans are unlike anything the city has seen, and I know they'll change the skyline forever. I can't wait to see our names together on the dedication plaque, as partners in both love and legacy." I'd never heard of any Meridian project. More disturbing, I'd never heard of Theodore Blackwood, despite my great-grandmother's obvious intimacy with him. According to family lore, Rosalind had been a secretary who'd married my great-grandfather, a construction worker named James Cross. She'd lived a simple life, they said, devoted to family and community service. But these letters painted a different picture entirely. The second letter, dated 6 months later, was written in a different hand. Theodore's response was brief and brutal. "Rosalind, I've decided to move forward with the Meridian project under my sole direction. The design concepts we discussed will be implemented as originally planned, but I feel it's best if you pursue other opportunities. I'm sure you understand that the architectural world isn't quite ready for a woman's touch on a project of this magnitude. I wish you well in your future endeavors." My hands shook as I read the final letter in the bundle, dated just 1 week after Theodore's dismissal. It was from the Boston Herald, a rejection letter for a job application. "Dear Miss Rosalind Hartford, while your qualifications are impressive, we regret to inform you that we cannot offer you a position at this time. Mr. Blackwood has advised us that your previous work was completed under his supervision and guidance, and we feel it would be inappropriate to hire someone who might have conflicting loyalties. We wish you the best in your future endeavors. Hartford." Her maiden name was Hartford, not Cross. I realized with growing horror that everything I'd been told about my great-grandmother's life was a fabrication designed to hide a devastating truth. Rosalind Hartford hadn't been a secretary. She'd been an architect. A brilliant one, apparently, whose work had been stolen by a man who'd then systematically destroyed her career. I spent the next 3 days reading through the rest of the materials hidden in that jewelry box. There were newspaper clippings about Theodore Blackwood's rising career, architectural sketches in Rosalind's handwriting that matched buildings I'd seen around Boston, and most damning of all, a letter from the mayor's office praising Mr. Blackwood's innovative design for the Meridian complex, which had apparently revolutionized affordable housing in the city. The Meridian complex, I'd walked past it hundreds of times without giving it a second thought. It was a gorgeous Art Deco building that housed over 300 families, with a waiting list that stretched for years. The architecture was stunning, flowing lines that seemed to dance with light, practical layouts that maximized both space and natural illumination. It was considered Theodore Blackwood's masterpiece, the foundation of a career that had made him one of Boston's most celebrated architects. But it wasn't his work, it was Rosalind's. I called in sick to work and spent the next week at the Boston Public Library, researching everything I could find about Theodore Blackwood. The man was 91 years old and still sharp as a tack. According to a recent profile in Architectural Digest, he'd been married 3 times, had 5 children, and was worth an estimated $40 million. His architectural firm, Blackwood and Associates, was still one of the most prestigious in New England. He'd received dozens of awards over the decades, including a Lifetime Achievement Award from the American Institute of Architects just last year. Every accolade, every dollar, every moment of recognition had been built on work he'd stolen from my great-grandmother. And she'd spent the rest of her life in silence, probably protecting the family she'd built with James Cross from the shame of a scandal that would have destroyed all of them in the 1950s. The rage I felt was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. It wasn't just anger, it was a burning need for justice that consumed every waking moment. Theodore Blackwood had lived a full, celebrated life, while Rosalind had been forced to hide her brilliance, to pretend she was something smaller than she was. He'd stolen her legacy and left her with nothing but secrets and pain. But he'd made one crucial mistake. He was still alive. I began planning methodically, the way I'd been trained to analyze financial portfolios. Every successful takedown requires 3 elements: information, timing, and leverage. I had the information, the letters, the sketches, the documentation that proved Rosalind's authorship of the Meridian Project. The timing was perfect. Blackwood was old enough that his memory could be questioned, but young enough that destroying his reputation would still matter. The leverage would be more complicated, but I had advantages he couldn't have anticipated. First, I needed to understand exactly what I was dealing with. I spent 2 weeks conducting surveillance, learning Theodore's routines, his weaknesses, his world. He lived alone in a Beacon Hill mansion, maintained by a small staff who'd been with him for decades. 3 times a week, he visited his office at Blackwood and Associates, where he maintained emeritus status. Every Sunday, he had lunch at the same restaurant, Chez Laurent, where he held court with other elderly members of Boston's architectural community. I started with the peripheral players. Using my credentials from Morrison and Associates, I reached out to several architecture firms under the pretense of researching historical building projects for a potential investment opportunity. The responses were illuminating. When I mentioned the Meridian Project, every architect over 60 knew the story: how Theodore Blackwood had revolutionized affordable housing with his innovative design, how it had launched his career, how it remained one of the finest examples of mid-century architecture in New England. But I also discovered something else. There were whispers, rumors that had persisted for decades. Several architects mentioned, almost in passing, that Theodore had been known for his collaborative approach early in his career. He'd worked with many talented designers, they said, though most had moved on to other opportunities. The pattern was always the same. Brilliant work would emerge from Blackwood's office, but the individual contributors would mysteriously disappear from the industry. I wasn't the only person Theodore Blackwood had stolen from. Rosalind had been his first victim, but not his last. This changed everything. A single case of plagiarism might be dismissed as a personal dispute, but a pattern of theft spanning decades would be much harder to explain away. I needed to find the others, the designers whose work had been absorbed into Theodore's legacy. If I could build a comprehensive case, the revelation would destroy not just Theodore's reputation, but the entire foundation of his architectural empire. I hired a private investigator, a sharp woman named Detective Morgan Phillips, who specialized in white-collar crimes. I told her I was researching my family genealogy and had discovered some inconsistencies in my great-grandmother's employment history. I needed to verify her work with various architectural firms in the 1950s. It was technically true, and it gave Morgan enough direction to start digging without revealing the full scope of my intentions. While Morgan investigated, I focused on the more immediate challenge of getting close to Theodore. I needed to understand the man behind the theft, to see if he felt any guilt for what he'd done to Rosalind. More importantly, I needed to find a way to make him confess. The opportunity came through my work at Morrison and Associates. Our firm had been hired to conduct a financial analysis of several historic preservation projects, including potential renovations to the Meridian complex. As the lead analyst on the project, I had legitimate reasons to request meetings with the building's original architect. Theodore Blackwood agreed to meet with me on a Tuesday afternoon in March. I'd prepared for this moment for weeks, practicing my questions, rehearsing my responses, imagining every possible scenario. But nothing could have prepared me for the reality of sitting across from the man who'd destroyed my great-grandmother's life. He was smaller than I'd expected, with the kind of diminished presence that comes with extreme age. But his eyes were sharp, calculating. And when he spoke about the Meridian Project, I could see the pride that had sustained him for over 6 decades. "It was my breakthrough project," he said, leaning back in his leather chair. "I was just 28 years old, barely out of graduate school. But I had a vision for what affordable housing could be. The city officials were skeptical. They wanted something cheap and functional. But I insisted on beauty. I believed that everyone deserved to live somewhere inspiring, regardless of their income." The casual way he claimed credit for Rosalind's vision made me physically ill. I forced myself to smile and nod, playing the role of an impressed financial analyst. "The design is extraordinary," I said. "The way you used light and space to create such an open feeling, even in compact units. It must have taken incredible planning." "Oh, it did." Theodore's eyes lit up with remembered satisfaction. "I spent months working on those plans. Every detail was carefully considered. The flow between rooms, the placement of windows, the integration of common areas. It was all part of a comprehensive philosophy about how people should live together in urban environments." Each word was a lie built on Rosalind's stolen dreams. I wanted to throw the letters in his face, to scream about the injustice of it all. But I forced myself to remain professional. This was just the beginning. "I'm curious about your process," I said. "Did you work with any partners on the project? I know collaboration was common in the architectural world at that time." For just a moment, Theodore's expression shifted. Something flickered behind his eyes. Guilt. Perhaps. Or just the ghost of an old memory. "I worked with several consultants," he said carefully. "Young designers, mostly. They helped with some of the technical aspects, but the creative vision was entirely mine." "Of course," I said. "It's just that I came across some old documents during my research, and I noticed a few names that weren't familiar to me. Rosalind Hartford, for instance. Do you remember her?" The change in Theodore's demeanor was immediate and dramatic. His face went pale, and his hands trembled slightly as he reached for his coffee cup. "Hartford," he repeated slowly. "Yes, I remember her. She was very talented, very dedicated to her work." "What happened to her?" I pressed. "Did she continue in architecture after the Meridian Project?" "I believe she moved on to other opportunities," Theodore said, but his voice lacked conviction. "The industry was different then. It was challenging for women to establish themselves in architecture. Many of them chose to pursue other paths." "How unfortunate," I said. "Especially if they had real talent." "Yes." Theodore agreed quietly. "It was unfortunate." I could see the weight of old guilt in his expression, the burden of secrets carried for too long. For a moment, I felt something almost like pity for him. But then I remembered the letters, the systematic destruction of Rosalind's career, the decades of stolen recognition, and the sympathy vanished. "Well," I said, gathering my papers, "I should let you get back to your day. This has been incredibly helpful for my research." Theodore nodded, but I could see that our conversation had disturbed him. As I left his office, I felt a grim satisfaction. The first crack in his confidence had been created. Now I needed to widen it. Morgan Phillips called me that evening with her preliminary findings. She'd located employment records for 12 different designers who'd worked with Theodore Blackwood between 1954 and 1967. 7 of them had left the architectural field entirely within 2 years of their association with him. Of the remaining 5, 3 had died in the intervening decades, but 2 were still alive. The first was a man named Robert Hansen, now 86 years old and living in a nursing home in Providence. The second was a woman named Patricia Wolfe, 79 years old and living in a retirement community in Springfield. Both had worked on projects that became signature elements of Theodore's early career. I visited Robert Hansen first. He was in the late stages of dementia, his memories fragmented and unreliable. But when I mentioned Theodore Blackwood's name, something sparked in his eyes. "Blackwood," he said slowly. "That bastard? He stole my bridge design. The Commonwealth Avenue Bridge. That was mine." I showed him the plans, and he said he'd help me present them to the city. Next thing I knew, he was getting all the credit. The Commonwealth Avenue Bridge was another of Theodore's celebrated early works, a graceful span that had been featured in architectural magazines around the world. Robert's claim aligned perfectly with the pattern I was beginning to understand. Patricia Wolfe was more lucid and infinitely more angry. She'd been a landscape architect, one of the few women in the field during the 1960s. She'd worked with Theodore on the design for Riverside Park, a revolutionary green space that had become a model for urban planning nationwide. "He was charming," she told me, her voice sharp with decades of resentment. "Very persuasive. He said we'd be partners, that he'd make sure I got full credit for the innovative elements." I was young and naive, and I believed him. I spent 8 months developing the water feature design, the integrated playground concepts, the seasonal planting strategies. Then he presented the entire project to the city council as his own work. "What did you do?" I asked. I tried to fight it. I had some of the original sketches, notes with my handwriting, but Theodore was already established, and I was nobody. He claimed I'd been working under his supervision, that everything I'd developed was based on his initial concepts. The city believed him, and when I kept pushing, he made sure I couldn't get work anywhere else in Massachusetts. Patricia's story was devastating and familiar. Theodore had used the same tactics on her that he'd used on Rosalind: isolation, professional destruction, the systematic elimination of any evidence that might challenge his claims. "I moved to California," she continued. "Started over in a different field entirely. I became a teacher, spent 30 years educating children instead of designing spaces. But I never forgot what he did to me. I never forgave him." "What if I told you I had a way to make him pay?" I asked. Patricia's eyes lit up with an intensity that made her seem decades younger. "I'd say it's about time." I spent the next 2 weeks building my case. Morgan had found documentation linking Theodore to at least 8 instances of design theft over a 15-year period. I had testimony from Patricia and fragmented memories from Robert. Most importantly, I had Rosalind's letters and sketches, physical evidence that predated Theodore's claimed authorship of the Meridian Project. But I still needed something more, a confession, or at least an admission that would be impossible to deny. Theodore was too smart to confess outright. But I was beginning to understand his psychology. He was proud of his work, even the stolen pieces. He wanted to be remembered as a visionary. That pride would be his downfall. I requested a second meeting with Theodore, this time proposing a more extensive interview for what I claimed was an academic paper about mid-century architecture. He agreed immediately, flattered by the attention and eager to share his legacy. This time, I came prepared with a hidden recording device and a carefully planned series of questions. I started with broad topics: his philosophy, his influences, his thoughts on contemporary architecture. But gradually, I steered the conversation toward specifics. "I've been thinking about our last conversation," I said. "About Rosalind Hartford and the other designers you worked with early in your career. I'm curious about the collaborative process during that era." Theodore was more guarded this time, but I could see he was struggling with the weight of old secrets. "Collaboration was essential," he said carefully. "No architect works in isolation. We all build on the ideas of others." "Of course," I agreed. "But there's a difference between influence and collaboration. When you worked with someone like Rosalind Hartford, how did you ensure that both contributors received appropriate credit?" "Credit," Theodore repeated, and for a moment his mask slipped entirely. "Credit is a complex thing in architecture. Ideas evolve. They change hands. They become something different than what they started as. The person who brings a concept to fruition, who navigates the politics and the practicalities, that person deserves recognition." even if the original concept wasn't theirs. Theodore was silent for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. Rosalind was extraordinarily talented. Her vision for the Meridian Project was remarkable, but she didn't understand the world we worked in. She thought talent was enough, that good ideas would speak for themselves. She was naive about the realities of the profession. So you helped her navigate those realities? I tried to. I really did. But she was stubborn, idealistic. She wanted recognition that the industry wasn't ready to give her. I thought if I could shepherd her work to completion, if I could make sure it got built, that would be enough. She'd have the satisfaction of seeing her vision realized. But she didn't get to see it realized, I said. She was blacklisted from the industry. She never worked as an architect again. Theodore's face crumpled. I never meant for that to happen. I thought she'd find other opportunities, that she'd understand why it had to be that way. The 1950s weren't like today. A woman couldn't have gotten a project like Meridian approved on her own. It would have died in committee, and all that brilliant work would have been wasted. So you stole it to save it? I saved it, Theodore said firmly. Rosalind's work lives on. Thousands of people have lived in the Meridian complex over the years. They've had homes, they've raised families, they've built lives in spaces she designed. That's her legacy, even if her name isn't on the building. It was a perfect rationalization, the kind of self-justification that had allowed Theodore to sleep peacefully for 70 years. But I could hear the doubt in his voice, the recognition that his noble intentions had been corrupted by ambition and fear. What about the others? I asked. Robert Hansen's bridge design, Patricia Wolf's park plans. Did you save those projects too? Theodore's face went gray. You've been busy, he said quietly. I've been thorough. I have documentation, Theodore. Letters, sketches, employment records, testimony from people who are still alive and still angry. I know what you did, and I know you did it repeatedly. What do you want? He asked, his voice cracking with age and fear. I want you to tell the truth. I want you to admit what you did to Rosalind Hartford and all the others. I want you to acknowledge that your greatest successes were built on stolen work. Theodore was silent for several minutes. When he finally spoke, his voice was that of a broken old man. I was 28 when I met Rosalind, he said. She was the most brilliant designer I'd ever encountered. Her mind worked in ways that seemed almost magical. She could see solutions that no one else could imagine. I was intimidated by her, and I was in love with her work. Were you in love with her? I thought I was, but I think I was really in love with the idea of possessing her talent. I wanted to be the kind of architect she was naturally. When she showed me the Meridian designs, I knew they would change everything, and I knew that if I could claim them as my own, I could build the career I'd always dreamed of. So you betrayed her trust. I convinced myself it was necessary. I told myself that I was protecting her from an industry that would destroy her. But the truth is, I was protecting myself from the possibility that she might succeed where I had failed. The recording device captured every word, every pause, every moment of Theodore's confession. I had what I needed for the final phase of my plan. There's something else, I said. Something I haven't told you. Rosalind Hartford was my great-grandmother. Theodore's eyes widened with shock and something that might have been relief. So that's why you're here. I wondered when someone would finally come looking for answers. She never told anyone the truth about what happened. She protected your secret for 70 years, probably because she didn't want to burden her family with the scandal. But she kept the evidence. She kept your letters, her original sketches, documentation of everything you stole from her. What are you going to do with it? I'm going to give her the recognition she deserved. I'm going to make sure the world knows who really designed the Meridian complex. And I'm going to make sure that everyone understands what kind of man you really are. Theodore nodded slowly. I suppose I've been waiting for this day for a long time. I've carried the guilt for decades, watching my reputation grow while knowing it was built on a foundation of lies. Maybe it's time for the truth to come out. Maybe it is. I agreed. I spent the next month preparing for the revelation. I contacted the Boston Herald first. pitching the story as a human interest piece about architectural history. The editor was immediately interested. The idea of a hidden scandal involving one of Boston's most celebrated architects was irresistible. But I wanted more than just a newspaper story. I wanted Theodore's confession to be public and undeniable. I arranged for a press conference at the Boston Public Library, inviting representatives from major newspapers, architectural journals, and local television stations. I contacted the mayor's office, the Boston Historical Society, and the American Institute of Architects. I made sure that Patricia Wolfe could attend, giving her the opportunity to tell her story alongside mine. The press conference was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in late May. I spent the weekend before finalizing my presentation, organizing the evidence, and preparing for the questions that would inevitably follow. I felt calm and focused, driven by a sense of purpose that had sustained me through months of investigation and planning. Theodore surprised me by asking to attend the press conference. He said he wanted to make his own statement, to take responsibility for his actions publicly. I agreed, though I wasn't sure what he intended to accomplish. The morning of the press conference, I arrived at the library 2 hours early to set up the presentation materials. I'd prepared display boards with photographs of the original letters, architectural sketches, and historical documents. I'd arranged for a projector to show enlarged images of Rosalind's work alongside photographs of the buildings Theodore had claimed as his own. The media turnout was extraordinary. Representatives from every major news outlet in New England were present, along with several national architectural publications. The room was packed with reporters, photographers, and members of the public who'd heard about the event through social media. I began the presentation with the story of finding the letters in Rosalind's jewelry box, describing my journey of discovery and the evidence I'd uncovered. I showed the audience Rosalind's original sketches for the Meridian complex, pointing out the distinctive design elements that had become Theodore's signature style. I displayed the letters that documented their professional relationship and its devastating conclusion. The audience was riveted. As I spoke, I could see the shock and fascination in their faces. This wasn't just an academic discussion of architectural history. It was a story of betrayal, injustice, and the systematic oppression of women in professional fields. When I finished my presentation, I introduced Patricia Wolfe. She spoke eloquently about her experience with Theodore, describing the theft of her park design and the career destruction that followed. Her testimony added crucial context to the pattern of abuse I documented. Finally, I invited Theodore to speak. He walked slowly to the podium, his age and frailty evident to everyone in the room. But when he began to speak, his voice was strong and clear. "My name is Theodore Blackwood," he said. "I am 91 years old, and I have been living a lie for 70 years. The room was absolutely silent. Theodore continued, his words measured and deliberate. "In 1954, I met a brilliant young architect named Rosalind Hartford. She showed me designs for what would become the Meridian complex, revolutionary concepts that would change how we think about affordable housing. I was intimidated by her talent, and I was hungry for the success I thought those designs could bring me." He paused, looking out at the sea of faces in the audience. "I stole her work. I claimed it as my own. And when she tried to expose the truth, I destroyed her career. I used my connections in the industry to ensure that she would never work as an architect again. I justified these actions by telling myself that I was protecting her from an industry that wasn't ready for a woman's vision. But the truth is, I was protecting myself from the possibility that she might succeed where I had failed." The confession continued for nearly 20 minutes. Theodore described each instance of theft, each betrayal, each life he'd damaged in his pursuit of success. He spoke about the guilt he'd carried, the knowledge that his entire reputation was built on stolen work. He talked about the brilliant designers whose careers had been destroyed by his ambition. When he finished, the room erupted in questions. Reporters wanted details, clarification, reactions from the architectural community. I fielded most of the questions, but Theodore remained at the podium, answering with the same unflinching honesty that had characterized his confession. The story exploded across the media landscape. Within hours, it was the lead story on every major news website. Architectural journals published special editions examining Theodore's stolen work. The Boston Herald ran a week-long series investigating the broader implications of the scandal. The reactions were swift and decisive. The American Institute of Architects revoked Theodore's Lifetime Achievement Award and expelled him from the organization. The mayor of Boston announced that the Meridian Complex would be renamed the Rosalind Hartford Housing Complex. Theodore's architectural firm dissolved within a month, unable to survive the scandal. But the most satisfying response came from the residents of the Meridian Complex themselves. They organized a memorial service for Rosalind, celebrating the woman whose vision had created their homes. They planted a garden in the courtyard with a plaque that read, "In memory of Rosalind Hartford, architect and visionary, whose dreams became our reality." Theodore died 6 months later, in November. The obituaries were brief and factual, noting his role in several important building projects while acknowledging the scandal that had destroyed his reputation. He died alone, his family having distanced themselves from him after the revelation. I attended his funeral, though I'm not sure why. There were fewer than 20 people in attendance, mostly employees from his former firm and a few elderly colleagues who remembered him from before the scandal. The service was simple and sad, a final chapter in a life that had been both brilliant and deeply flawed. After the funeral, I visited Rosalind's grave. I brought flowers, the same white roses I'd brought every Sunday when she was alive. I told her about the press conference, about Theodore's confession, about the recognition she'd finally received. I promised her that her story would be remembered, that the truth would outlive the lies. Standing in that quiet cemetery, I felt a sense of completion that I hadn't expected. The rage that had driven me for months had transformed into something else. Not quite peace, but a recognition that justice had been served. Rosalind's legacy had been restored. Her work acknowledged, her brilliance finally recognized. But I also understood that revenge is a complex emotion. Theodore's confession had given me what I'd sought: vindication for my great-grandmother and recognition of the injustices she'd suffered. But it had also revealed the human cost of those injustices. Theodore had lived for 70 years with the knowledge of what he'd done, and that knowledge had poisoned everything he'd touched. I returned to my job at Morrison & Associates, but I found that I'd lost interest in financial analysis. The months of investigation had awakened something in me, a passion for uncovering truth and fighting for justice. I began volunteering with organizations that supported women in architecture, helping to ensure that the kinds of systemic discrimination that had destroyed Rosalind's career couldn't happen again. I also started writing, documenting the stories of other women whose contributions to architecture had been overlooked or stolen. I discovered that Rosalind's experience wasn't unique throughout history. Women's work had been claimed by male colleagues, their innovations credited to men who had the power and privilege to claim ownership. The process of seeking justice for Rosalind had taught me that revenge isn't always about punishment. Sometimes it's about restoration. It's about returning stolen recognition to those who deserved it, about correcting historical injustices that have been allowed to persist for too long. Today, the Rosalind Hartford Housing Complex stands as a monument to my great-grandmother's vision. Thousands of people live in the spaces she designed, their lives enriched by her understanding of how architecture can create community and dignity. Her name is carved in stone above the entrance, where it should have been 70 years ago. Theodore Blackwood is gone, but his buildings remain. The Commonwealth Avenue Bridge still spans the river. Patricia Wolf's Park still provides green space for the community. And the other stolen works continue to serve their intended purposes. The architecture survives, but the truth about its creators has finally been acknowledged. I think about Rosalind often, about the dreams she was forced to abandon and the secrets she carried to her grave. I wonder what other buildings she might have designed, what other innovations she might have contributed to the field she loved. The theft of her work wasn't just a personal tragedy. It was a loss for everyone who might have benefited from her vision. But I also think about the other women who are designing buildings today, who are fighting for recognition in a field that has historically excluded them. Rosalind's story has become part of a larger conversation about equality and justice in architecture. Her legacy lives on not just in the buildings she designed, but in the opportunities that exist for women today, because people like her refuse to give up their dreams. The letters that started this journey are now housed in the Boston Public Library's special collection, available to researchers and historians who want to understand the hidden history of American architecture. Patricia Wolfe has become a regular speaker at architecture schools, sharing her story with students who are just beginning their careers. The truth has been told, and it's being passed on to the next generation. Sometimes I wonder if Rosalind would have approved of what I did. She'd kept Theodore's secret for 70 years, choosing silence over scandal. But I think she would have understood that times had changed, that the world was finally ready to hear her story. She would have wanted other women to know what was possible, to understand that their contributions mattered even if they weren't immediately recognized. The most important lesson I learned from this experience is that justice isn't always about punishment. Sometimes it's about restoration. Theodore's confession didn't bring Rosalind back, but it restored her place in history. It gave her the recognition she deserved and ensured that her story would be remembered. My great-grandmother's love story wasn't the fairy tale I'd imagined as a child. It was a story of passion and betrayal, of dreams deferred and justice delayed. But it was also a story of resilience, of a woman who continued to love and create even after everything she'd worked for was stolen from her. In the end, the truth proved more powerful than the lies that had hidden it. Rosalind Hartford's name is now known throughout the architectural world, her work studied and celebrated. Theodore Blackwood's reputation lies in ruins, but the buildings he stole continue to serve their communities, now properly attributed to their true creators. The past can't be changed, but its legacy can be restored. Sometimes that's the most meaningful revenge of all, not the destruction of those who wronged us, but the elevation of those who deserved better. Rosalind Hartford finally received the recognition she'd earned, and that makes all the pain of uncovering the truth worthwhile. As I write this, I'm looking out at the Boston skyline, at the buildings that define our city's character and identity. Some were designed by celebrated architects whose names are known throughout the world. Others were created by people whose contributions have been forgotten or stolen. But all of them represent human dreams and ambitions, the desire to create something beautiful and lasting. Rosalind's buildings are part of that skyline now, properly credited to the woman who imagined them into existence. Her great-grandparents' love story had a different ending than anyone expected. But it was ultimately a story of triumph over injustice, of truth overcoming deception, of a woman's genius finally receiving the recognition it deserved. That's the story I wanted to tell, the legacy I wanted to preserve. It's a story about the power of persistence, the importance of speaking truth, and the possibility of justice even when it comes decades too late. It's my great-grandmother's story, but it's also the story of countless others whose contributions have been overlooked or stolen. The truth has been told, and it will endure long after all of us are gone. That, I think, is the most powerful revenge of all.